So I think I'll just introduce myself quickly. I've been at TopCashback for over 3 years. I used to be a placement on the design team as a designer. Did a year there, went away, finished uni, worked for another company for a year, and then I came back as a developer within the design team. And I've been here 2 years as a developer as well, so 3 years in total. I am certified in and very passionate about web accessibility, but I'm obviously by no means an expert. I'll kind of come on to this a bit more later on. A little known fact about me, I've actually got my own accessibility issue. I'm actually deaf in my left ear, which not many people know. It doesn't mean I require too much adjustment or anything like that. And I don't, I can kind of, day-to-day life's kind of normal for me, but it kind of helps me a little bit to be a bit extra empathetic, I think, to people that do have like greater accessibility needs. And that's kind of why I've kind of become so interested in it. I've kind of made it my own little project, I guess, for the last sort of year and a half. So yeah, it's good to get started in this. Right. So a quick introduction then about what this talk is about. It's just going to be kind of the fundamentals of web accessibility. But even though I say fundamentals, there's quite a lot of content because it's such a big sort of topic area. So basically, we're just going to be understanding accessibility, what it is, why it's important, how we can ensure that all the content we create and we work with is accessible, understanding accessible needs users and their certain requirements as well, and then obviously any sort of legislation and standards and legal issues around accessibility that we have to comply with. And it's just going to be just web accessibility. Because I know that sort of accessibility in general is a huge topic, and there's a lot more than just sort of online web accessibility. And just want to give a shout out to the Workplace Accessibility Working Group. I'm not sure if that's what you actually call yourselves, but I've put a link to the presentation that they did recently. They've been doing some good work about sort of improving the office, the Stafford office, and making things more accessible from that point of view. But yeah. So let's get started then. So what is web accessibility then? So web accessibility is generally when like online services, websites, tools, technologies are specifically optimized so that people that have got impairments can use them. And there's a good little quote at the bottom, which is from the W3C. We'll get onto who they are later on. And they just kind of say that web accessibility is essential for some people who have impairments, but it is actually useful for everyone, and even people without certain impairments can benefit from good accessibility. Another quote here from Tim Berners-Lee, who actually is the inventor of the World Wide Web and works for the W3C, who we're going to come on to. He says, the power of the web comes from its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. So it's kind of about just creating like a global community which is accessible for everyone and no one is excluded from that. Cool. So what is the W3C then? So the W3C, it stands for the World Wide Web Consortium, and it's basically a non-profit organization that kind of sets certain standards on the web. And they have their own, it's a lot of acronyms here, but WAI, the Web Accessibility Initiative. And that kind of basically just outlines certain standards that relate to accessibility. And then they also provide a lot of free online support as well and learning materials that anyone can access. So I was going to say that web accessibility itself is accessible, if that makes any sense. So kind of all the resources out there are free, online, centralized, anyone can access them, anyone can learn. And as I said at the start, I'm not an expert in this. Like anyone can learn about it. I just kind of, maybe like 2-3 years ago, I kind of knew nothing about it. And I've just been kind of learning and getting involved, and that's how you can learn about it. And there is actually a free course which kind of is going to teach you everything that I'm going to teach you, but there will be more to it as well. And it's free. You only pay if you actually want the certificate from it, which I did. I just wanted the certificate, sorry, but you don't have to pay for it. You can do the course for free. And there's a link to the course and all the web accessibility stuff there, if you want to come back to that. Right, so why is web accessibility important then? So thank you. I'll give a shout out to Abby Foster from SEO, shared this first stat with me. So around 17% of web users actually have some kind of disability or impairment and require some form of adjustment. So I think the thing about web accessibility, it's just about removing all barriers, giving users the freedom to kind of use our services however they want to, and not kind of, creating silos and that sort of thing. Just making an open, accessible, free service. And I think the important thing to remember, and it's very important about web accessibility, is that it should be non-negotiable, really. So it should really always be considered within project planning and sort of requirements, definitions and stuff like that. And it should always be a must-have. Like, it should never be a should or a could-have. It shouldn't be if we get time, we'll make it accessible. It should be one of the core sort of features of any project. So what are the benefits of good web accessibility then? I think it's good in terms of its future-proofing the business. So it's, as I've got here, it's not currently a legal requirement to kind of meet any certain standards, but it likely will be very soon. And I'm going to get onto this in a bit more detail. We're kind of making our services available to the extra 17% of people which have accessible needs, which we currently might not be able to access or use all of the services problem-free. So it's kind of more sign-ups, increased market share, that kind of thing. Improved public perception as well of the company for sort of anyone really, like prospective users, current users, the media, people who are applying for jobs, that sort of thing. And sort of if we have good accessibility, it allows us to really stand out as against any competitors that might not be very accessible. And it also gives us the potential to be recognised as sort of a leader in the accessible cashback industry, if that was a thing, ever became a thing. And then there are sort of other benefits, too many to list really, but it generally comes hand in hand with SEO as well. So when you make a good accessibility improvement, like 9 times out of 10, it will also improve SEO, which is search engine optimization, for anyone who's not aware. Basically how well web pages rank when you do a Google search, that kind of thing. So there's so many benefits to web accessibility. So we'll have a look at sort of impairments and what are they, sort of thing. So generally an impairment is a limiting factor that makes it more difficult to use a website or an online service. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical limiting factor. It can be sort of an environmental factor as well. So the word disability is sometimes used, but generally disability means something physical or, psychological, cognitive, whereas impairment kind of is a bit more general, and it means the environment as well. So I think the truth about impairments, as I've kind of mentioned, there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. So every single individual is different. You could have one person who is, partially sighted that prefers one way of using a website, another person who's partially sighted in the exact same way but has a completely different preference. And then one person might classify themselves as having an impairment, someone else might not. It's completely down to the individual, and it shouldn't be like no assumption sort of thing, no one-size-fits-all approaches. This is kind of what I've just mentioned, isn't it? So there's sort of different ways to categorize impairments then. So we'll start on the left. So as I've kind of mentioned about the impairments, so you can have a permanent impairment, which is something that people most likely have and have had forever, or have had for a long time and most likely will always have. You can have a temporary impairment, which is something that someone, maybe like an injury or something that someone has not always had, but they've got it and it's likely to go away. And then, as I mentioned last slide, there's also the situational impairments as well, which is kind of caused by the environment that the person is in. And then the actual types then, we kind of have vision, hearing, physical and speech, and cognitive as well, which are kind of the main 5. It's kind of self-explanatory what they are, but we'll get onto this in a bit more detail in a second. So as you can see, when you kind of classify them in these sort of ways, you kind of get like a 2-dimensional table. So if you can kind of see, I don't know if you can see my mouse, can't you? So a permanent visual impairment could be something like partial or total blindness, whereas a temporary visual impairment could be something like sore eyes, tiredness, like something that affects your vision, but it's not going to last forever. And then situational impairment. So this is not just thinking about physical things and mental things. It's kind of the situation that you're in. So like, just say you're on a beach. I'm sure we've all been there at some point when we've been sort of in really bright sunlight trying to read something on a phone screen and it's just not bright enough to the screen's not bright enough to see it. Or the other way around, if you're sort of in a really dark room at night or something, reading something on your phone and the screen's really bright and it's hurting your eyes and you can't concentrate, that would be a situational visual impairment. And I'm not going to kind of go through all of them, but some of the other ones, like maybe like a movement impairment, situational. Maybe if you're holding a baby in one hand and your phone wants you to use two hands to zoom in and you just can't do it because you've only got one free, that sort of thing. Or maybe like a temporary speaking impairment could be like a sore throat, or you've lost your voice so you can't speak into a microphone, you can't use Alexa or anything like that, that sort of thing. So there's quite a few common misconceptions then, I think, about impairments just in general. So I'm going to do some like myths and then kind of the truth afterwards. So the myth is like that sort of 99.9% of users don't require any accessibility adjustments, like, accessible needs people are only the 0.01%, whatever. I mean, as I've kind of mentioned, it is around 17%, but that's just the people that actually require adjustments to use sort of, online services. The percentage that actually might not have a sort of impairment but then still benefit from an adjustment anyway, or prefer to use accessible software, is even higher than that. So the second one is kind of, a lot of people think accessibility is only about like blind people or colorblind people. It's always about like the eyesight. When the truth is really that impairments is about a lot more than that. And obviously visual, as I've said, is just one of several types. And it's even, accessibility is even about people without impairments, just making services a lot more accessible just for everyone. Again, I hear it quite a lot in my sort of role where people think it's just something that developers need to worry about at the end of the line, or like designers. It's not something that sort of, like people who sort of send messages or like write blogs or anything like that need to worry about. But the reality is that sort of anyone who works with online content in any way, so whether it's like I said, writing a blog, writing a hub, putting promotions on the website, social media, anything like that, everyone kind of should know about accessibility and has some responsibility to do that. Excuse me. Another one is that a lot of people think that they've never used an accessibility feature, or probably couldn't actually name one. But the reality is you probably all use them. So a keyboard which you use to type with, which I'm guessing the majority of people probably have used a keyboard here, was actually invented as an accessibility feature originally. And then obviously it's kind of become mainstream, and that's what happens. The same with dark theme as well, on mobile and websites and whatever. I'll come on to this a bit more later on. And then another one is that accessibility is, a lot of people think it's too difficult to learn, there's not enough reward from it. But the truth about that is that accessibility, like I said, is kind of free to learn, very easy to learn. You don't have to go as in detail as I've gone here, just to kind of learn little bits that kind of suit your kind of line of work or whatever. And the benefits are kind of, as I mentioned at the beginning, quite huge. So little effort, massive reward, really. So I'm going to sort of, I was just going to actually mention, if anyone has any questions, if you want to save them till the end, and then we can have a little sort of 10 minutes at the end if there's time. But yeah, so we'll look into some of the sort of common assistive technologies that people with impairments use, but also people that don't have impairments might prefer to use, and you've probably heard of some of them. I guess we could do a bit of interaction. So I think if you use the like raise your hand button in Google Meets, if you've used them. So just out of curiosity, how many people have used dark theme, or sort of prefer to use dark theme, whether it's on a mobile or a website or anything like that? I'm seeing quite a lot of hands actually. I did a little survey about this, and I think it tends to be sort of 50-50. So some people prefer light theme, some people just prefer dark, some people like a combination, but a lot of people use it basically. And it was invented again as an accessibility feature. It's useful for people who struggle to see bright lights and prefer a dark, sort of softer interface, but it is just kind of used by a lot of other people. Another one then, I guess you can raise your hands to if possible. How many people, when you're watching Netflix or anything like that, have subtitles on? seen quite a few hands, probably not as many as before, but quite a few. Again, I think subtitles is basically how it works. It converts, spoken speech into text, and then you can read the text while you're watching. And it was, again, originally invented for people with hearing impairments who struggle to hear, maybe like they can't, or maybe fully deaf people that can still want to watch Netflix and whatever. But it became beneficial to a lot of people that just generally, like, maybe you just don't want to miss what's said. And like quite a lot of shows are quite quiet and you miss a little bit, so you get to see everything that's said. Or maybe a situational impairment, if maybe you're on a bus or a train, aeroplane, you've not got earphones or something like that, and you want to watch Netflix, you put subtitles on, and then you can see them. Yeah, sorry, I just clicked the wrong thing there. Make sure we're still going. Yeah, and then audio descriptions as well. Don't expect many people. Probably this is a less common one. Don't expect many people to have used it, but it basically provides a description of what's happening on the screen. So if there was a man walking to a door, it would say like, oh, the character is walking to the door, opens the door. And basically for people who have limited vision or visual impairments, it allows them to still watch a show and enjoy it, and they can understand what's happening without actually seeing it. Yeah. And then text to speech as well is sort of, and speech to text, both ways. It basically converts text to written speech or speech to text. And it's kind of like useful for sort of, like Google Assistant, Alexa, Siri, that sort of thing. Maybe you're sort of driving and you ask your car, like, oh, what's on my calendar today? And it's like, I've one event at this time. And it's kind of, again, the situational impairment of you're driving, you can't use your hands to use a screen. This is an accessibility feature which becomes useful to you. And I think this is the last common one. Yeah, so sort of screen magnification as well, to kind of zoom into the screen and make things bigger. I'm assuming some people have used that. I actually use it quite a lot. I think I generally have quite a bigger zoom because my eyesight is really, really quite poor. And yes, it's kind of invented for people with impairments, but then used by a lot of other people as well. Hopefully that kind of all makes sense. Now that was a lot of talking, that bit. I'm just going to look into some kind of more specialized assistive technologies that people probably haven't heard of or might have heard of less. So the first one is a screen reader, which is kind of an assistive piece of software that lets the user kind of navigate through a website by listening to audio feedback. So it's mainly used by blind users, so who can't see a screen or have very limited vision. And they can kind of just swipe or maybe click around or use a keyboard, and then it tells them what they've got selected, what's on the screen, and then they can, use certain hotkeys and shortcuts on the keyboard to actually get around. Yeah, so that's that one. It's quite a common one actually for blind people, but not every blind user will use this, as I will come on to a bit later on. I'm hoping this is going to work, but I'm going to show you a very quick video about screen readers and how they work. Can I just get a few thumbs up when I play this if you can hear it? Is anyone able to hear this? Sorry, you can't hear it now. Okay, I'll leave that there. I'll play the video and I'll talk over it. Subtitles are on, but basically, so this is a blind user. I think he's totally blind or very limited vision, and he's got a screen reader enabled on his phone, basically, so he can access websites and whatnot. And basically what happens is I'll just turn the subtitles off so it's not too distracting for you. Oh, it's part of the video. Basically, he can navigate by swiping, and you'll see it in a second. You'll see what's actually on the screen. Just kind of advance a little bit on. Oh, sorry about this. This is not how I planned for this to... There we go. So obviously the blind user cannot see what's on the screen, but the screen reader still shows it anyway. But every time the box moves to a certain section, it will read out what's in there to him, and then you can be like, right, it says I've got the year thing selected, and then I can type in, I know it's wanting, a year for the date of birth, so I can type that in. And that's how it works. You kind of use little motions like swiping and things like that, and then it feeds back audio, sort of an audio response, and then it tells you like what's going on the screen and how it's working. So it's not fully uncommon, this sort of method, and it's also useful for people that have got sort of certain cognitive sort of disabilities as well, and impairments. Might find it easier to hear things back to them rather than having to click around and read and process things visually, that sort of thing. I'll come on to that a bit more later on. I know that's quite quite confusing probably for some people. So yeah, another sort of less common accessibility feature is sort of button switches. If you can see this example here, it is actually an Xbox controller designed by Microsoft, but it's not sort of the normal Xbox controller that you hold in your hand and you sort of, you press the buttons and whatnot. It sort of is a, it's sort of got big buttons, so you can use any sort of limb to hit the button, and it makes people that have limited mobility, limited dexterity, that they can still play games and enjoy things. And there's different versions of these that exist for the web as well. It's not just for sort of gaming. And then this is sort of a really uncommon one, but I actually learned about this as part of the training course that I did for W3C accessibility. And it's sort of used by people that have very limited mobility, that might not have any use of their sort of hands to control a web, like sort of a browser, by sort of breathing through a straw. So breathing in air and blowing out air sort of is how it, and you're speaking to a microphone as well, and it's sort of, that's how you control it. So yeah, I know that was quite a lot, but the point that I'm trying to make there is that accessibility options and the amount of them, it's almost kind of limitless. There isn't any way you can know about them all. You can't remember them all. So that's why we need to, rather than focusing on, yes, we'll make it accessible for, screen readers, you just have to make sure you do the right thing and make it accessible for everything. And then it's up to the user then to decide how they want to use the services. Just going to have a sip of water 1 second. But yeah, so I'm going to share a real story now about a member. Some of you might remember this was mentioned in a pizza meeting some time back. I think it was last year that I did this. A shout out to, I'll do that at the end actually. Basically, it was a member called Andrew Green, who's been a member of TopCashback for sort of 10 plus years. He was registered blind with very limited vision. He basically got in contact due to some accessibility issues on the site. He couldn't submit a support ticket for some reason. I think something to do with the way his eyes work and his preferences, whatever. He struggles to see content when it's a white background with black text on it. He prefers a dark theme where it's a black background with white text. I think he had his email app or whatever was dark theme, but then when he clicked a link to get to our support tickets, it kind of, we don't have a dark theme, so it forced a light theme, and he couldn't see and he couldn't put in a support ticket. And one of the points that I'm going to make about this, about not making assumptions with web accessibility, and I kind of learned this the hard way, but I'm glad that I did it, was before the call with Andrew to find out more, I kind of assumed, I knew that registered blind didn't mean fully blind and that you can have some vision. But I assumed that he used the screen reader, which was the video I tried to show you with like the swiping rather than actually clicking and seeing things. So I prepared a bunch of questions like based on it. But it turned out that I'd kind of incorrectly assumed that, and he didn't use a screen reader. He'd never heard of one, even though that might have been the best solution for him. He, in his case, he preferred to kind of try and use what vision he's actually got left, because he's got like a little bit of peripheral vision around the edge of his eyesight that you can actually see. So he preferred to try and still use that while he's got in. And I kind of never thought about that. But it's until you get talking to real users and you see real use cases that you don't actually think about that stuff. So yeah, he uses a screen magnifier to zoom really far in, and he's got a personal assistant as well, which kind of helps him. He's kind of lucky that he's got someone to help him. If like our site doesn't have a dark theme, it's quite inaccessible. His personal assistant would make him an account, and then he could still use the services. But sort of, like I said, we don't have an option for dark theme, and most users probably don't have their own personal assistant. And if someone's fully blind or whatever tries to use a screen reader, they would really struggle big time with our sort of how things are at the minute, I guess, on the TopCashback website. Yeah, like I said, I learned just never to make assumptions. Each user is completely different, has got their own sort of different requirements, but also different preferences as well. Sort of something to think about. And like I said about Andrew wanting to use the vision that he's got left, it's something that I didn't really think about. I just thought it was kind of black and white. He has got limited vision, he used a screen reader, but that wasn't the case. So it was very interesting, and it kind of helped me to develop some empathy as well, which I think is really important when you're sort of doing this sort of thing. Right. So now we're going to get into something called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or I'll call them the WCAGs from now on. Basically, it's a kind of set of guidelines by the W3C, the kind of organisation that sets the guidelines and the standards relating to web accessibility. Don't worry too much about like the versions and different numbers, but basically the latest version came out in October 2023, so it's very, very recent, very up to date, and that sort of thing. And it tends to have sort of 3 levels of like compliance and how far you have to take accessibility. So single A, this first one, is kind of like basic compliance, like sort of literally the bare minimum. So if you're not meeting this standard, then you really are lacking. And to be honest, we are missing it in quite a lot of places. I'll get onto this again a bit later on. And then sort of AA standard is like standard level compliance, sort of what could be considered the average, like what you should be aiming for. And I've kind of put this little TopCashback icon to kind of say that it would be nice if we could be aiming for the AA compliance in sort of everything eventually. Like it'd be nice to like look back in a few years' time and say, right, we are sort of now, we're meeting AA standards in more or less everything. And then there's a AAA, which is more for like sort of specialized software. So if it was like a government service that kind of is aimed at blind people, then you'd expect it to meet the AAA standard, but it's a bit sort of too much for us, so we don't have to worry about the AAA, just focus on the AA where we can. I'll get more into this later on. And again, not to worry too much about the details here, but it tends to be split into 4 sections, the guidelines. So it's split into perceivable, understandable, operable, and robust. Perceivable, which basically just means that you can actually perceive the information. So if it was a blind user, they still get all the same information as a sort of visual user, that sort of thing. Understandable is just kind of make sure the information is presented in a way that actually makes sense to the user. It's all well and good having a bunch of text on there, so the blind user can actually perceive that the text is there, but then if it's not written and organized in a way that actually makes sense to them, then it's not going to be understandable. Operable kind of allows users to correctly, navigate and use a website, regardless of their method. So again, maybe a keyboard only user might not be able to use a mouse for whatever reason. Keyboard only would mean that obviously the website would have to be set up to work for that, to kind of let them navigate through and actually do everything that they could do with a mouse, but with a keyboard. That's just one example of making something operable. And then the 4th one is robust, as I mentioned. It's sort of just kind of meaning that a website can be used by a range of devices, browsers, assistive technologies, operating systems, that sort of thing. It isn't restrictive at all. It's kind of open and accessible. So I think before we kind of delve too far into the WCAGs, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, I think it's called, just a few I'm going to look at the legal requirements, I guess, for accessible content at the minute. So as I mentioned, there isn't sort of anything legally saying you've got to meet the WCAGs just yet. What does exist, this is just for the UK, I don't know if there's people from other regions, but this is just UK. There is similar things in the US and sort of Europe, EU, that sort of thing. But the 2010 Equality Act basically protects people from discrimination in the workplace and in wider society. And how it kind of ties into web accessibility is that we cannot purposefully exclude certain user groups. So like we can't be like, oh, let's just not design for blind people, because then that would be, again, breaking the law really. So as I said, there isn't any legal requirement to meet the WCAG standards, but in the European Union next year, there is actually an act called the 2025 Accessibility Act, which is coming in June next year. And it basically will make WCAG compliance mandatory. So basically, if your website doesn't meet the certain accessibility standards, then you will, I don't know what the punishments are, but it might be fines, that sort of thing. And I think I can say with almost certainty that the UK will probably follow at some point within the next 5 years, and we'll have our own sort of accessibility act. And then that's when it becomes important as a business to meet these WCAG guidelines. So that's why it's important to start kind of now, as I mentioned, future-proof things, rather than wait until, something happens, panic, and then, do things wrong. We can start early and make things right. So I'm just going to again, I appreciate I've been talking for 30 minutes now. I hope I'm not boring you too much. Just going to look into some of the important guidelines within the WCAGs that people should know about. There are a lot more, and this is like a non-exhaustive list, but it's kind of the ones that are mostly general to most people, like and that sort of thing. So the very first guideline actually talks about alternative text. So alternative text, or it's also known as alt text. Some people might have heard of it, some people might not. It's basically a text replacement, like a description of an image. So if you imagine a blind user tries to see an image, they won't obviously be able to see it. So they'll need some kind of text description to describe to them what's going on. And basically the guideline, the first one, it's a level A. So basically it's the bare minimum is that all text content should have alt text available. And I'll come on to this again later on, but it is something that we are missing in quite a lot of places. So as I've mentioned, I've already mentioned that. So I guess the general best practice for alt text, and it's really not difficult to learn. It's very simple, but you just keep the alt text to one sentence. It doesn't have to be a paragraph, anything like that, I think. And you don't have to say image of a coffee cup, image of a car. You just kind of say coffee cup on a whatever background, that sort of thing. And I think just the main thing is to keep it short but descriptive, and just kind of describe everything that's on the image, but keep it short. But if the image doesn't actually add any extra content or context, alt text is not required. So just say there was like a nice flower pattern or something in the background, just for design purposes. Like you wouldn't need alt text for that. There'd be no point because it doesn't actually add anything, any extra information. So yeah, I'll show you some examples of writing alt text then. So imagine you've been given this image. It's a Ferrari 2024 F1 car, Formula One. Even if you're not familiar with Formula One, you can probably guess that it's some kind of race car. But if the alt text that was provided was just something like this, like if it was just car, then it could be any car. It could be a BMW. It could be like anything. And we see it quite a lot where the alt text literally just says image, which provides even less context. It's like, it could be an image of anything. It could be saying like, get £1 million free cashback, or it could be saying like, whatever. And we quite often see alt text literally saying alt text as well, which again is even worse. It's just kind of confusing for the user. Or missing alt text entirely just again provides absolutely no context and doesn't help. So the alt text should be something like this, just kind of a side view of the 2024 Ferrari Formula One car driving around a track. You kind of get it, a side view, Formula One car driving around a track. It gives you all the context you really need to know for that one. And here's an example actually on the site. I got this morning, this screenshot. So it's one of the carousels we've got for Compare Home Insurance. And it's the same for a lot of the carousels we've got, like for hubs and things like that. Again, it's a little bit technical here, but the text on this one is actually part of the image. It's not within the HTML, so it's not sort of part of the website. It's on the image itself. So if you imagine a blind user trying to see this, it doesn't have any alt text at all. So you might as well just show them a blank carousel, because literally for a blind user or anyone that is non-visual or using any kind of assistive software, because there isn't any alt text, they can't read what's on here. So they literally get like a blank. They can't see anything. So that they're just excluded from this. So if you think a lot of the hub carousels we've got and other promotions on the site where text is part of the image, if it doesn't have alt text, then that's what a lot of accessible needs users will see absolutely nothing, and will just be excluded from that entirely. So yeah, how that kind of makes sense. Without alt text then, so non-visual users, like I said, have got no way of actually knowing what's on the screen. We should avoid images generally that have got text on them wherever possible. I know we use quite a lot where the text is part of the image, but you should, like I get there's certain use cases for it, but we should be really steering clear of that. And like I said, we've got a lot on site at the minute that do that. And it should never be optional. I hear it quite a lot where people say, oh, do we need alt text for this? And it's like, it should always, like I said, unless it's for decoration purposes, it should always be sort of a must-have requirement. It should never be optional. And it also has SEO benefits as well. It could be worth mentioning. So the next kind of one to look at is sort of guideline 1.4. Again, don't worry about the numbers and the levels too much. It's just about distinguishable content. So making content easier for users to see and hear. And this sort of requirement mainly outlines the use of color, which kind of maybe most people have probably had some experience with at some point, using color on with text and that sort of thing. So basically, the guideline says don't use color as the only way of conveying information, whether it's in descriptions or maybe you're sending a message to someone and talking about colors, or you've got an image. And the only way to differentiate between things is through color. Excuse me. And it's mainly due to colorblind people and people with reduced vision. So 8% of men are colorblind, and there are actually lots of different types of colorblindness. And 15% of over 45s have got reduced vision as well. So these are the types of colorblindness. Some people might be aware. Basically, it's sort of, you can have like you can get, I'm trying to think of the word for this. Basically, you can struggle to differentiate between your reds and greens, like these ones, or you struggle to differentiate between your blues and your yellows as well. So the outer ring is what they would see, and the inner ring is normal color. Or you can be completely like blind to any color and just see things in black and white, really. So imagine you've got sort of like a picture of 3 medals, or maybe you have you give awards for cashback or something, how much you've earned. Gold medal, you've earned loads of cashback. And then the only way of differentiating between them is the color. For someone, I mean, there may be people here that have actually got color blindness, but for people with normal vision, we can see there's a gold medal on the left, silver in the middle, bronze on the right. But for someone who's colorblind, they wouldn't be able to tell the difference between them, or they might struggle, especially between the gold and the bronze, maybe. So without any additional help, they wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So you would, in this case, you'd be expected to do it like this, where you have some text as well to kind of differentiate between them. Because then even if you are colorblind, you can still see that this is the bronze medal, because it kind of says it is. Yeah. Right, and I think another example then that I've seen quite a lot is when people kind of use color for like descriptions or instructions, like this one on the merchant pages. Click the pink button. For someone with normal vision, pretty easy, you can see this one's pink. But for someone who has a bit of color blindness, I can't remember which one this is, but this is one of them. They might struggle to differentiate between sort of the cashback button, this information icon, because they both look very similar to them. But then if you change the description to click the pink get cashback button, you can see, there's only one button that says get and cashback inside, so it's got to be that one. And it's still fine to use colors for instructions, but the point being, you've got to use something else to explain that. It can't just be the color, or you'll have problems. And then the distinguishable content guidelines, and it also talks about sort of color contrast as well, which is basically just the difference between 2 colors. So if you can see here, there's 2 examples. One is sort of low contrast, which is dark text on a dark background, the ratio being 1.73 to 1. Whereas the one on the right is sort of light text on a dark background, very high contrast, and it meets the sort of standards, basically. I'll come on to this in a moment. So the standards are the sort of, the AA standard says that any sort of large text or icons has got to be a 3:1 contrast ratio minimum, which this one is more than that. It's a 4.04 to 1. But it says that smaller text and like regular body text, like, in like a blog, which the main text needs to be 4.5 to 1, which this example actually isn't, but it's quite close to it. So I think the point that I'm going to make here is that kind of try and get as close as you can to the WA standards for contrast, but it is quite strict actually, so it's quite difficult. So just, I guess, use common sense there if you can. And this is a link as well, I'll send this at the end, to a very useful contrast checker, where you can put in some color values and it tells you the contrast ratio, and then you can get a pass and a fail description as well, which is quite useful. So you can see, whether it'd work for large text, normal text. Don't worry about the AAA. Like I said, that's very much, that's overkill really, but you're looking at the AA standard, the normal level of contrast, and whether it passes or fails. I hope that makes sense to you. Again, I'm happy to answer any questions at the end if anyone's got any. Right, so the next standard that I'm just going to kind of touch on this very briefly. It's more relevant to developers really, so I can speak about this more in the future. But this standard basically says that all functionality must be accessible using a keyboard, and the general controls for a keyboard is tab to move, right between elements on the screen, Control and Tab to move left through elements, then Enter to select, or like click a link or something like that. And there's these certain features. Again, it's very, very technical, very only applies to developers, but you can use this tab index 0 attribute to actually make things selectable, which, you know, actually lets you select them on a keyboard. You can use JavaScript to do the same thing that would happen when you click on something, but also when you press enter. And then you can use CSS, which is basically to add an outline around things when you've got it selected as well. Again, most people probably won't understand that. I don't expect you to. I'm happy to provide any extra training or like answer any questions on this if anyone's got any questions at the end. But yeah, we'll move on from that one. Right, coming towards the end, I believe now, not too much to go. I'm sure you'll be glad to hear. So this section is about readable content, section 3.1. I believe it's level A, that might not actually be correct. And basically it's about making sure content is readable and as readable as possible. And I think it's good to remember that, again, accessibility is not always about physical disabilities. It could be about someone who's not a native speaker or has got limited, you know, reading ability, limited technical ability as well, limited skills using a computer or whatever. Or someone who's maybe got limited cognitive skills or an impairment somehow. So one of the main points to make, and again, this might be relevant to a lot more people, is when you're sort of writing instructions or writing anything, you should avoid using the words left and right, because quite a lot of people, a lot more than you would think, struggle with left and right, or maybe someone who's, again, got a cognitive impairment might not know what left and right is, or maybe someone with, you know, that sort of thing. So don't say things like, you know, click the button at the right hand side. You could say like, click the green sign in button. I think top and bottom generally is fine, but left and right, definitely avoid it. Also try and avoid complex metaphors as well, and sort of business jargon, sarcasm. These things are quite hard to understand, even for the best of readers, never mind someone who's, you know, English isn't their first language, that sort of thing. And any sort of abbreviations, or if you are using business jargon, you have to make sure you explain it like early on the top of the document or whatever, just of top of the message, or make sure they understand, you know, what you're abbreviating, that sort of thing. And hyperlink text is also like links that you can click on. They need to be specific, and you need to avoid sort of things like click here, download now, because it doesn't provide any context to what the link does, even though everything else might provide context around it, the rest of the text. For someone who uses a screen reader, they tend to navigate by just hovering on the links rather than reading everything, so it's very difficult for them to hear everything read out to them. So it's probably better to avoid doing things like this, click here, download, and instead try and always do things such as this. Continue reading the article. It explains what it's going to do. View more products, you know what it's going to do again, and redeem this offer. Maybe you could put redeem, you know, something different there, but hopefully you understand the point that I'm trying to get across there. And then it also mentions about sort of presentation of text as well. So generally, when you've got a large sort of body of text like this, you shouldn't have it center aligned. It should always sit, well, at least in English language, left aligned. Because obviously, if you can see this line here, like the start of the sentence or the text on each line, it's not consistent. And again, some people with like cognitive problems might struggle to actually process that, whereas when it's kind of left aligned, it sits a lot more neatly, and it's a lot easier for people to understand. The other thing here is header text as well. So like when you've got a header and then a section of body text below it, you need to make sure the header text somehow is differentiated from the rest of it. So the left example, it's quite similar, you know, it's very similar, but on the right example, it's a lot bigger, bolder, and it stands out. And again, for people that are kind of scanning through or have limited cognitive abilities, whatever, it's a lot easier for them, and it's just generally better for user experience as well, for that sort of thing. So that's what I mentioned, the alignment of text and headings. Right, so I think we're near the end now, actually. I was going to just talk a bit about the current kind of state of accessibility at TopCashback, and again, kind of linking all of this to how things are at the minute. So I think it's fair to say that historically we haven't thought about accessibility enough as a company. It's something that's kind of we've had little bits here and there from what I'm aware of, but we haven't done a lot. I know that some teams, I think the app team have done quite a bit of work recently, and I mentioned about the office accessibility team as well, and there's been little bits here and there, but I think it's probably time that we really tackle it and we really kind of, again, we make it a priority, because there's a lot of accessibility issues with the services. I think there was a complaint actually that was sent to me yesterday by, is it Phil Simpson, I think, who a member was having trouble, like he was another blind member, basically like the Andrew Green guy, that was having trouble signing up, and these things just seem to be happening, and unless we do something about it, then they're probably going to keep happening. And you know what I mean, it's just about time that something's done. Bear with me one sec. But yeah, I think it doesn't always have to be that way. Like, things don't have to be inaccessible. It just kind of, awareness itself is a big step forward. All you come into this kind of top talk and showing interest, and hopefully you've learned a bit. I know there's been a lot of content, but it's a big step forward, and it's a good first step. And I think it just requires some time and being sort of intentional as well, and planning planning accessibility, making it a priority, and not just kind of having it in the background. You've got to make it a focus. But I do think kind of collectively across the board, if we all make little sort of improvements for accessibility, like just everyone makes a little improvement in the work, collectively our services and everything will start to just become a lot more accessible as a whole. But it kind of needs everyone to be on board with it, and everyone to be kind of doing the same thing. So yeah, I'm just going to wrap up now. I know it's been literally 45 minutes of me talking, quite quick as well, so hopefully that's not been too difficult to understand. And like I said, I'm going to share the slides at the end as well, and obviously if you've got any questions, there'll be sort of maybe 5-10 minutes at the end to ask any. But just to wrap up then, so accessibility, if you're going to take anything away from this, it's that accessibility is and has to be a must, like a must-have. It's not negotiable. You can't sacrifice it, you can't compromise on it. It's got to be a must. And like I said, it's everyone's responsibility. It's not just developers, not just designers, like people who work in customer service when you kind of like writing instructions, or people who write blogs, or anything that's online content. It involves you, and you have a responsibility, sort of thing. If that makes sense. There'll be a lot more examples that I can't think of, but I'm sure 99% or even 100% of people here, it will sort of impact you. And then as well, like I mentioned, the accessibility resources are free and available to anyone, so anyone can learn more. Anyone can kind of, do what I've kind of done and just learn a bit more and make it a bit of a focus. And yeah, so just to wrap up, obviously these are not clickable for you guys, but excuse me, I'll leave this, I'll send the slides, and there's some useful resources here. So the W3C website, the WCAG guidelines, so you can look through them all. It's a quick reference guide, so it's quite nice and easy. It just tells you basically a brief summary of each one, and you can understand it. Some information on the the upcoming EU 2025 Accessibility Act, and also a link to the contrast checker as well that I mentioned. But yeah, so yeah, as I mentioned, thank you all for listening. I know that was probably quite long. Hopefully you enjoyed that, at least, or learned something, I guess. And yeah, if anyone's got any questions or anything, just feel free, you can ask them now.